So I'm Tom Fournier from the History Symposium, and we're welcoming back Donald E. Graves to a new session in this series. Don is a well-known Canadian military historian who published his first work on a War of 1812 subject in the late 1970s, and since that time has brought out 5 books on 1812 topics, as well as 3 volumes of memoirs, and edited a new edition of a classic history of the war. Don Graves has also produced 11 books or monographs on other topics of Canadian military history, ranging from 1690 to 1945. This is episode 2 of what is planned to be a number of conversations with Don that we will host and archive here on our YouTube channel in a distinct playlist. So, welcome back, Don.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I think we both confessed to too many digressions the first time, so we'll try to stay on point and on topic today. So,
We'll try.
all right. So, this might consume the entire allotted time. I'm going to delve into what seems to me one of your favorite figures from the War of 1812, and that's Thomas Pearson. What is it about him that has drawn your attention? And maybe you can give us a little perspective on who he was.
Well, before I give you the perspective, I want to tie that into the fact that the British Army, having been at war by 1812 and been at war for close to 18 years, had grown or produced a great series of officers of middle rank, major to colonel, who had experience, and they knew what to do and when to do it and where to do it. And because of the nature of the defense of British North America, hundreds of miles, generals couldn't be everywhere. So these field grade officers had a great deal of responsibility, more so than they would have had in Europe. And the British Army was fortunate enough that they had of young officers. They were in their early 30s. There was Cecil Bishop in the Niagara. There was John Harvey, um, Burlington. There was Charles Michel de Salaberry in Quebec. There's Joseph Watson Morrison uh, on the St. Lawrence. Yeah, there was Tom Pearson. Thomas Pearson. He interested me because I wrote a book on the Battle of Crysler Farm. He played a major role in it. I wrote a book on the Battle of Chippewa. He played a major role in that. I wrote a book on Lundy's Lane. He played a major role in that, and he played a major role in the siege of Fort Erie. So he, as far as I know, the only British officer who fought in the 4 bloodiest engagements of the War of 1812 in the North, and he was wounded in 2 of them. So that intrigued me. That was the first thing that brought him to my notice. The second thing was in the memoirs of the Times, um, particularly of the Canadian militia, but some of the British memoirs too. They thought he was a bad-tempered old bugger and a martinet, and they disliked him. Everybody disliked him, but they wanted him to be on the battlefield when they were on the battlefield because he really was a stickler for professional behavior, dress, et cetera, et cetera. You have to remember that Tom Pearson was an officer of the Royal Welch Fusiliers, the 23rd Foot, one of the finest regiments in the British Army. He joined it in 1996, 1796, and had fought with the 23rd in Holland, Egypt, uh, Denmark, landed Russia, but didn't fight Spain, Portugal, and Martinique, and had acquired 2 wounds before he even got to Canada. Um, he was badly wounded in Spain and invalided out of the peninsula. And Sir George Prevost, having heard that he was available, particularly requested his presence, or rather requested him to be assigned to the staff in Canada because Prevost knew him from the Martinique expedition because he was the commanding general of Pearson's division.
So
So,
if I can intercede for a moment for the
sure.
benefit of our audience who might not know a lot about the War of 1812, Sir George Prevost was the Governor General of British North America, correct?
Yep.
Okay, thanks.
British North America consisted of all the North American colonies, Upper Canada, Lower Canada, Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Cape Breton Island, which was separate, and Bermuda. Did not include Newfoundland.
Huh.
Okay, so Prevost had been the Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia and had done fairly well there. And then, so he was promoted to become the Governor General of Canada and the Commander in Chief British North America. He asked for Pearson, and Pearson, who'd I think had broken his thigh bone in several places when the horse fell on him in his last engagement in Portugal. In any case, it was a very tricky injury, and I don't think he ever recovered from it. For one thing, one leg was shorter than the other, and for the other thing, I think he suffered from pain through most of the rest of his life, but that didn't stop him. So anyway, Prevost requested him. Uh, Pearson was at his family's residence in Somerset with his wife, Anne Coffin, who was a Canadian girl, and his infant son, Thomas. So they took ship and they got to Halifax, um, checked in their luggage, basically, caught another ship for Quebec City, which is the headquarters of British North America, and they were hardly out of sight of the mouth of the harbor when an American privateer popped up and took them prisoner, took the small ship they were on a captive as a prize. And so Pearson and family were on our way to the United States. They just got almost in the sight of Salem, Massachusetts, which was the privateer's home base, when a British frigate arrived and recaptured them, retook the ship, and the privateers, American privateers, were destined for prison in Halifax. Anyway, he finally got to Quebec City. He um, did a little work there. Then he went down to Montreal, and Prevost appointed him to command at Prescott on the St. Lawrence, north shore of the St. Lawrence. Now, this is a very important post because lake vessels, large vessels, could come as far down the St. Lawrence as Prescott, and below that there were the five rapids of the St. Lawrence, where the river dropped some 200 feet in elevation. And this could only be run by boat convoys with experienced boatmen. So Prescott was this interim point. So goods coming up were landed at Prescott and then reshipped on lake vessels. And also troops coming up came up by boat convoy and then landed at Prescott. It was an important point, important place. It was just a newly established community. One British officer quipped that there's only five houses in the place, and three of them were still being built. Um, but Pearson took hold there, and he was to stay, except for a brief 2 month hiatus when he was sent to Kingston. He was to stay there from the late autumn of 1812 to the spring of 1814. Now he did all kinds of things. First of all, he went across to Ogdensburg on the American shore and said, "You stay neutral, uh, and I won't fire on you. And there'll be no damage, and you can trade freely, and I'll let Canadians come over and shop." David Ogden, an American entrepreneur, had a store which sold iron goods, so he did that. However, uh, when an American company of riflemen stationed itself to Ogdensburg, he regarded this truce as being over, and even more so because the riflemen under the command of Major Benjamin Forsyth raided Brockville and Gananoque, the two Canadian villages on the North Shore. And this really annoyed Prevost. So this being the winter of early 1813, he then drew up plans to go across the river, frozen river, and take Ogdensburg. And he did this like he was drilling troops on the ice of the river. And his plan was that every day the Americans got used to see the British out drilling and marching back and forth. His plan was that one day they'll just march right across the river. However, before he could put that plan into place, Prevost arrived, making a tour of inspection uh, of Upper Canada, and he took Pearson with him because he had a job for him to do it at Kingston. The commandant at Kingston had, for some reason, been shifted. He needed a fairly senior officer. So Prevost went to Kingston. Sorry, Pearson went to Kingston, and the day the party rode out of Prescott, Major George MacDonnell of the Glengarry Light Infantry uh, Fencibles put that plan into practice, and they marched. He got his men out drilling, and then they went right across the river and took Ogdensburg and kicked Forsyth and his rifle company out of the area. After which things and Pearson in Kingston, Pearson did a lot of things. He was a very busy man. First of all, he settled a putative strike at the Royal Navy dockyard, I think with threats to hang the ringleaders, but got a new superintendent of construction appointed. He uh, he took at this time the squadrons on the Great Lakes weren't part of the Royal Navy. They were the Provincial Marine, and it was actually an Army organization which reported through the Quartermaster's Department. So Pearson decided to be an Army. They came under his purview, so he inspected them, uh, had whole gun drill. He wanted to see how good the gun drill was, and generally buffed them up, as he would probably put it. And one officer, one commanding officer, not being sufficiently energetic, he clapped him in cells for a few days till he got the point. Um, the other thing was he established the first fortification on the high ground where Fort Henry now stands. So he saw right away that that was an important point. But in the fullness of time, he went back. He was sent back to Prescott, and during the summer of 1813, he was extremely busy. He was running an espionage and spy network through the United States. He had a spy in Sackett's Harbor who visited, or rather visited, rendezvoused with two of his Canadian officers, gave them information about what was going on at Sackett's Harbor, et cetera, et cetera. He he was responsible for trading licenses, for permissions to leave Canada. Um, you had to have exit permission at this point. He was responsible for breaking up a counterfeiting ring. At this time, the specie was in short supply, and army bills uh, were being accepted as paper currency, and they were good. They could be trusted. So it wasn't long before someone decided they could be counterfeited. So we had to break that up. He mounted he didn't attack Ogdensburg again, but he mounted a few raids across the St. Lawrence, and on and on. It was a very busy summer. In October 1813, he was alerted to the fact that the American army was massing at Sackett's Harbor. James Wilkinson's army had about 7,200, I think, made it 200 troops. That was the largest uh, assembly of American regular units prior to the Civil War, because during the Mexican War, they weren't regular units, they were volunteer. And Wilkinson had almost regular units. I find that an interesting point. Anyway, he warned and alerted entire north bank of the St. Lawrence. He posted a militia officer named Daniel Clark, Lieutenant Daniel Clark, um, probably around Brockville, to give news, to give warning if he saw the American flotilla, because they were moving in a flotilla of small boats. And Clark did that, and then decided wanted to go down and warn the North River bank. He had no horse, so he commandeered a plow horse and took off at a furious plod. And the Canadian Paul Revere, the Yankees are coming by sea. If you get the reference.
Yeah.
In any case, Pearson had a 1,200 men in the garrison at that point, and the Americans had to get by Prescott, and they were very wisely disembarked the army on land, uh, considerably before Prescott, and marched them through at night, and then ran the boats through. They're just lightly manned at the same time. There were about 300 watercrafts. Um, and by this time, Pearson had something like 32 pieces of artillery in place. Um, and he opened fire. There, the Americans were lucky there because it was a very dark night. Um, all kinds of uh, shells, but only one craft was struck. And the American flotilla got down and re-embarked the army, and then moved down even farther and disembarked them on a Canadian shore. At this point, Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, Joseph Morrison, arrived from Kingston with what was known as a harassing force. He had about 800 men, 89th and 49th Foot, uh, and good troops. And he was going to follow the American army down the St. Lawrence and snap deals and just generally caused all kinds of distress. Pearson offered to join with him, so he took Pearson took about 400 men from his garrison. Um, Let me see now. There's some Canadian fencibles. There's some Voltigeur Canadian, and he didn't take any. He didn't take any of the incorporated militia. I should mention the incorporated militia battalion was was new. Sorry, I'm having a bit. I lost the picture.
Well, I still see you. You're still coming across here, and I can hear you throughout. So,
Okay, well I'll go on. So
yeah.
he joined together with Morrison. They marched down, snapping at the heels of Wilkinson's army, and of course we know what happened on the 11th of November. Um, Wilkinson didn't do it himself because he was on board his little boat, sick with dysentery, but he ordered a subordinate to turn back and get these British off his back, and thus we had the Battle of Crysler's Farm, which I won't go into. Now, the American army then fell down to French Mills, now Fort Covington, New York, and Pearson was sent to uh, Cornwall to take over the garrison there. Now, you have to remember, Pearson was a martinet with a bad temper. I suspect that his uh, his injury caused him pain, which uh, made him irritable all the time. My wife said that one of the reasons I was interested in him because I have the same personality, which uh, which I protested. Who would say that about me? I'm a pussycat. Now, how did these rumors get started? Anyway, he he made quite an impression on the militia in Cornwall, smartened them up, buffed them up, and uh, was well known to the local civilian population. Uh, but he was ordered back to Prescott. A local character named Peggy Bruce, who's talked about by a number of um, um, officers who served at Cornwall. She was quite the character, an Irish girl, and she met him on the street just after the news had come around that he was leaving, and she said to him, "Ah, Colonel, we hear you're leaving us. Sure, there'll be many a dry eye in town the day you go." I, what's Pearson going to say to that? As I said in my book, and probably the only thing he'd do was give a dignified harumph and march on. So back to Prescott, um, more of the same. Watching the other side of the river, he, uh, from this time, he all the time he was at Prescott, he was asking for a more active position, either command of a offensible or regular line battalion. But there are two things. First of all, there weren't that many vacancies of those positions, and second of all, he was doing a very good job where he was, and a very important job. Um, he also oversaw the construction of Fort Wellington. He wasn't in charge of the engineering, but he provided the labor, and the officer who was in charge of the engineering, Lieutenant de Galgraben, who Pearson thought was an idiot. very common, very common opinion of Pearson's about a number of officers. He barked at Galgraben's heels. He also, I should mention this, he also had this post as being inspector of inspecting field
Inspecting,
officer militia,
yes.
which had the duty of inspecting the militia to see that the training was right, and that uh, the arms, equipment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, were, and also, and he was hard on militia officers. He was at a review of one unit, and the commanding officer of the unit got flustered, and he kept saying, as you were." And Pearson up with this for a while, and he said, as you were. I'll be damned if you are as you were, because you're not half as good as the last time I saw you." And which had a known effect. Um, okay. So what I'm probably going into too much detail on Pearson's career. This is what happens when you write a book on a man. You got lots of detail.
Yeah.
Um, but what we have here is an officer with a lot of experience, all kinds of experience, and a good record in the field. And this is a kind of officer that was missing in the American Army. The American Army was more or less broken up in 1783 and had not participated in a lot of combat, and they didn't have this generation of field grade officers who could, in a pinch, take over. So this is an important thing to remember. Remember, at Crysler's farm, not only did Morrison have two regular units, the 49th and 89th, he had John Harvey as an advisor, and he had Pearson as a subordinate. So this is the kind of expertise you had. Anyway, I'll try and roll forward here. We haven't digressed too much, have we?
No, no, it's not unexpected, a lot on Pearson. How about you quickly tell us how he ended up in the Niagara for that summer fall campaign of 1814, and that'll kind of wind down his war. So
Yeah, it did wind down his war. In the spring of 1814, Lieutenant General Gordon Drummond, who had taken over as commander-in-chief in Upper Canada, asked for his services. Um, and so Pearson left Prescott and was given a brigade down in the Niagara, a demi brigade it was called, because it didn't have the standard three to four battalions or units. It only had two. One was the Glengarry Light Infantry, and the other was the Incorporated Militia. The creation of the Incorporated Militia, by the way, was a concept of Pearson's. Um, the previous, in the winter of 1812, 1813, he wrote to Prevost that what was it? The generality of Canadian militia officers are idiots. It would be a good idea to take the best of the militia units, turn them into a battalion, and train them with having British officers in command and as advisors. And the idea was taken up, but Pearson probably thought he would get the command, but he didn't. Anyway, he spent a lot of time at Prescott because the Incorporated Militia there for a long time. Spent a long time whipping them into shape. So when he got to the Niagara in May 1814, he brought them under command again. Now, I don't want to get into long detail about the Niagara campaign, um, but the American Army, Major General Jacob Brown's left division, uh, crossed the Niagara on the 3rd of July, 1814. Pearson was at Chippewa with a couple of companies of regulars, a troop of cavalry, and a division that is two guns of the Royal Artillery, and a group of indigenous warriors. He went down to see what was happening, realized right away that the Americans were in too great a strength for him to attack, so withdrew a little farther to the north. Around there's a series of creeks. I haven't got them all in my head between Fort Erie and Chippewa, now the Welland River. I think there's five or six. Um, what happened was the next day, Brown instructed Brigadier General Winfield Scott to move north to Chippewa and seize the bridge. And if that was not possible, to select a good, secure campground. So Scott set off, uh, came to the first creek, and there's Pearson with his infantry, the guns, his cavalry up the creek a bit so they can't be flanked. And the wooden bridge over the creek, they've torn up the planks uh, on the bridge. So Scott is forced to deploy into line and get ready and bring his guns up. And just Pearson timed it nicely, just as Scott's about to open fire. Boom, the British disappear to the next creek with a rear guard of the cavalry. So the next creek, same thing. And it went on creek, creek, creek. It started around noon and probably ended around 5 o'clock. When Scott finally got to the Chippewa, now Welland River, he found that the British had dropped a section of the bridge uh, into the water, and they had a large number of artillery pieces in battery and opened fire on him. He then decided best he's done his day. He's done his day's duty. He withdrew to below the next southern creek, which was Streets Creek, and camped for the night. Uh, Now, on the next day, 5th of July, uh, Brown's 2nd Brigade, also a regular brigade, had come up during the night. And Ryle, who was um, amassing troops at Chippewa, who was going to attack, sent scouting parties of warriors and militia over the river to scout out the American camp. Unfortunately, or well, it's natural, I suppose, they started sniping the American camp, and this annoyed everyone. Brown uh, decided you'd have to get rid of it. And his third brigade, which was a volunteer brigade made up of militia who'd volunteered for service outside the U.S., had come up. So they were put into a long beating line, and they moved north into the woods between the Chippewa River and the American camp. And it started as a little skirmish. The British and Canadian skirmishers fell back, and they were pursued by a very large group of uh, American allied warriors, Tuscarora and Seneca both, and things were looking pretty bad. When they got to the edge of the woods, uh, bordering on the Chippewa, and they were met by a disciplined rifle fire, and it was Pearson. He had the flank companies, the light companies rather, of the 100th, 8th, and 1st Foot, and he then moved south again. Now I'm getting into too much detail. The story of the Battle of Chippewa is that it was the first time, I think, it was the first time during the war that an American army took on a British army in the open and won. The British they were beaten, they withdrew, they took heavy casualties. Um, they weren't routed. They withdrew in good order, but everyone knew they had been beaten. So they went across the Chippewa. Now, I, I'll fast forward to 3 weeks. Brown had gone north to see if uh, he could draw the British garrisons out of the forts of the river's mouth, Forts George, Niagara, and Mississauga. And also, he was expecting the U.S. squadron on Lake Ontario to arrive, and they never did it. He needed their heavy guns to breach those forts. But failing that and failing to get the garrison to come out in the open, he withdrew to Chippewa on the 24th. The next day, hearing that the British were coming down the American side of Niagara, um, he sent Scott north on the Canadian side of the Niagara with orders not to see what was happening, but not to bring on an engagement, which Scott disobeyed. He brought on an engagement with the British Canadian force posted along a sandy ridge, um, traversed by a country road called Lundy's Lane after William Lundy, a farmer who lived uh, up in the Peace. And this was the Battle of Lundy's Lane, which I won't get into detail. When it was over, the Americans held the ground. They held the British guns, but they decided to withdraw. Withdrawal became somewhat confused. They left all the guns except one, which he managed to take away with him and withdraw back to Chippewa. Pearson was wounded in that action. Couldn't have been a bad one because he was back in service in about 2 weeks. So all in all, Brown decided to retreat. I should mention that Brown was wounded. Ryle was wounded and captured. Drummond was slightly wounded. Um, General Porter, the commander of the Volunteer Brigade, was wounded. And command devolved upon General Eleazar Ripley. He decided to withdraw to Fort Erie. He did so and began to entrench. Fort Erie is a very small, two company sized post, but Ripley began to expand it, building earthworks south. No, I get this straight. Yeah, south.
South and
So
west.
his
Yeah.
south and east, I think.
No, so west towards Snake Hill, right? So that'd be going down the Lake Erie shore. So,
Oh yeah, okay, you're right. The directions often get strange down the Niagara for me. Anyway, Drummond came along, tried to lever the Americans out of Fort Erie by attacking Buffalo to destroy their supply depot. See, all the time the so-called siege was going on, um, the American Army had good communications with Buffalo. It was only a mile across the lake, so they could get food, ammunition, reinforcements easily. Uh, but Drummond couldn't cut them off. All he could basically do was hover around the northern flank and send patrols around the rest of the perimeter. So he decided he would try a coup de main, an assault. That went in on 15 August, and it was the most disastrous thing, as one Canadian militia officer said, it was the most disastrous thing that happened to us during the war. It was the assault was rebuffed. Um, Nearly 900 casualties of all types suffered, and that was it. So Drummond then just continued to hover around the northern flank, built new batteries. Uh, there's a lot more to this than I'm telling you. Finally, on the 17th of October, or on the 15th of October, September, sorry, 15th of September, he decided to withdraw to Chippewa, and British and Canadians were in the process of withdrawing the guns from the battery when the Americans boiled out of the fort and in a sortie. There was another heavy battle. Uh, the American sortie was fought off, but since the British had already decided to withdraw, they just continued the withdrawal. That sortie fighting cost 1,000 casualties from both sides. And at that point, Pearson was badly wounded. It was a rifle bullet or musket ball right here, and he was blinded temporarily. And there being no ability to use his services farther, Drummond sent him back to New Brunswick with his adjutant as a with his adjutant to guide him, and he went to his father-in-law's estate near Frederickson, where his wife and son were, and he stayed there until the following year. So that was Pearson in the War of 1812. He had a lot to do. He has a lot to do in the War of 1812. And when I started researching and writing, thinking about him, I was wasn't upset, but I was irritated by the fact that so many British officers who fought in the war, who did considerably less than he did, uh, had entries in the Dictionary of Canadian Biography. Um, and I said that in my book. Like the only thing I saw, there was no village or town named after him, and the only proof that I ever saw that he was actually in Canada was a plaque at Fort Wellington, which said that uh, Left, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Pearson was instrumental in the construction of this fort. So I noted that in my book, and I thought this this fellow deserves. Well, about 3 years, no, 3 or 4 years later, the Dictionary of Canadian Biography contacted me and said, "Well, would you like to write a biography?" I said, "Yeah, sure, I'll do it." So I wrote the biography. I don't know when that was. I think 5 years ago it was finished, and it still hasn't appeared. It's going to be in a digital collection. It still hasn't appeared. It would seem that the mills of the DCB ground very slowly, uh, but one day it'll be there. And you'll be able to look up his Pearson uh, in the DCB. And
Well,
I think that is about enough we should say about Pearson.
Well, we'll highlight the book you wrote on him. And so, failing the DCB, we do have your excellent book describing him. So, uh, that's one of your favorite figures, a man you admired. I'm going to skip a couple questions, keep an eye on time. Do you have one that you dislike?
Well, I'd have to say Joseph Wilcox, the traitor, but you have to keep a fairly balanced attitude when you're a historian. So, you know, he was a he was a wretched man, but we can't just say that. You have to prove it. That would be the one I dislike the most.
So, one of my digressions, if you'll humor me, my friend Ross Flowers, who's not a historian and doesn't have to keep a balanced perspective, he once got banned off Twitter for a couple weeks because he voiced his active dislike for Wilcox and the Canadian Volunteers. I think he was a little too graphic in his description of what he thought should have happened to them. So, and then I'll put a link in the episode description. I know you did a whole section on Wilcox with Marinus Zaida in his Stories of 1812 podcast, so people can check that out there. In your opinion, who was the top British general?
Um, I'd have to say Gordon Drummond. Now, Brock was a good general, but he didn't see that much action. The second major battle, he was killed. Drummond saw a lot of action and was responsible, for the defense of Upper Canada in 1814. Also, the American army that Drummond faced was far different from the American army that other British generals had faced during 1813 and 1812. He was now dealing with a properly led, properly trained organization, and they caused him some grief. So yeah, I would say Gordon Drummond.
Okay, and then how about the top American general?
I would say Major General Jacob Brown. He's almost unknown in the States because he never became president, but the Americans generally choose Andrew Jackson or William Henry Harrison, who did become president, as their best general. But the thing is, Jacob Brown fought and won more engagements against British regular troops than any other general during the war. Um, yeah, I'm going to stay with Brown.
And then I think he was very instrumental in creating that American army that was part of that Niagara campaign, right? They had a
Oh,
like a
oh yeah,
winter training camp near
yeah.
Buffalo.
Well, he has assembled the army at Flint Hill near Buffalo and gave it over to Winfield Scott to train. And Scott was in many ways almost an American version of Pearson, but gave them the regular units had 10 weeks of training. And that's quite a bit, and certainly was more than any other American force had received during the war, and its performance shows. Yeah, but Brown was created that opportunity for Scott to properly train that division.
All right. And then who would be the worst generals from each side?
I don't know because the British generals who screwed up, like Schaeff and Royals, they also did good things. They were up and down. It was luck of the day, basically. I would say on average, overall, the British generals were basically competent. They were really great, but they were competent. And of course, as I said, they had this generation of young field grade officers to do the legwork for them. So I can't really say there was a bad British general.
Proctor?
Proctor Proctor gets a lot of grief, which he doesn't deserve. Um, he he was never properly supported and given responsibilities and given directions, which was very hard for him to carry out. His worst example is the retreat from Amherstburg, which ended up in the Battle of the Thames. And there's no doubt that he was at that point he got the collywobbles and he just was not performing. But he had been a good officer up until that point. So I would say Proctor, but again, he's bad on some days and good on others.
So, a bit of a wild card. Can you think of an officer, if they had been given a more senior command, might have had a far greater impact in the war?
British or American?
Either.
Do you mean British or American?
Oh, I said either. It's if
Oh,
someone
okay.
comes to
I
mind.
didn't catch that.
Okay, yeah.
Um,
But someone like Morrison, you talked about him earlier at Chrysler's
yeah,
farm.
but Morrison wasn't a general. He was a lieutenant colonel.
No, and
Um,
that's what I mean. If he
yeah,
had
okay.
been
But
given a general's position.
again,
Yeah.
again, given the promotion structure of the British Army, it's hard to sort of promote a colonel to general, brevet general, and give him an appointment for for which there were several other senior generals in Canada um, ahead of him in line. I don't know. Uh,
It's all right to say it's a goofy question too. We
it's a
try
goofy
and see
question.
what comes out of them, right? So yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it's a goofy question.
All right, I'll take that. I can take that. All right, last question. This was inspired by the conversation we had in the first episode
Well,
where you talk.
just a second here.
Yeah,
What about the Americans?
sure.
Um, I'll tell you. I mean, there's a lot of competition for who was the general, but I my favorite is Alexander Smythe or Smith. Some say Smythe, some say Smith. Alexander Smythe. Uh, I wrote an article about him just a couple of years ago. Um, Smythe was a lawyer, a Virginia lawyer, and member of the state government. Um, he was a colonel in the militia, and during the Chesapeake crisis, he was offered a position in the regular army, and his adjutant general, not sure about that. His major role was to write a manual for the army, and he produced a very good manual based on the French uh, 1792 reglement, to which he added most of the material on camps and garrisons from von Steuben's little blue book manual, and produced quite a practical little uh, source of information. And it came out just in April 1812. That was the best thing he ever did. The worst thing he ever did was appoint him to a field command, and he arrived in the Niagara in late September 1812 with a couple of rather green uh, regular regiments and took post in Buffalo. And when Van Rensselaer, Sullivan Van Rensselaer attacked across Niagara at Queenston, uh, he had ordered, which there's a big problem here, um, a militia general ordering a regular general to do something, and Smythe didn't do it. Smythe did not join in that attack, and of course we know what happened. Um, Battle of Queenston Heights, Brock's killed, the Americans are defeated. So then Smythe was appointed commander of Niagara, and the next, I don't know, three times he uh, gathered his troops together uh, to cross Niagara. But every time he used to issue these bombastic pronunciamentos in the style of Napoleon. And and then he back off. Then he call it off. And his troops were getting really disgusted with him. Um, Soldiers' nicknames for the generals are often very indicative, and he was known as Van Blatter, um, takeoff on Van Rensselaer. And it got so bad that they were snapping their muskets at him um, with the wooden keeper and the flint lock were snapping at him, and he finally had to withdraw from the camp and be specially guarded. Well, to cut this long story short, he applied for a leave to return home, which was quickly and immediately granted, and he went back to Virginia. And then in the spring of 1813, a new Register of American Officers was published, and his name wasn't on it. He was basically legislated out of the army, and so he then brought this to the attention of Congress and petitioned Congress to be allowed to die in the service of his country. Congress just ignored that, except one wag said, "Too bad that petition wasn't granted." And there you have Alexander Smythe. Uh,
So I'm
yeah,
not sure if I'm remembering this right or if it was him because he tried crossing the Niagara River a couple times late in 1812 near Fort Erie, right? And
yeah.
didn't one night assault, he tried to lead the attack, like stepped off the boat and was in over his head in a sinkhole
No,
or
that's
something?
that's Winfield Scott.
Oh, was it? Okay.
On the night of July the 3rd, Winfield Scott was in the lead boat of the American river crossing, and Scott, being Scott, several yards before the shore, thought the water was shallow and went in up to his neck. That's Scott. He was always a thruster. No,
Okay, okay. Maybe
I don't think Smythe ever got in a boat. Um,
I'm mixing up my memories,
yeah.
but it's maybe for a future episode we can talk about the time Winfield Scott tried to find the British at Burlington Heights and got lost in the woods around Burlington or Oakville. So,
Winfield Scott is uh, somewhat overblown figure. He was 6'4", um, probably weighed about 200 pounds. He's a big man, and he was absolutely fearless. There's no doubt about that, and absolutely determined to have his name carved in the halls of posterity. So there you go. Yes, we have to talk about Winfield Scott.
well,
Did
he
you
was
have another question there?
yeah, I have a last question.
Okay.
So, the previous episode we talked about Sir George Prevost, and he was present at the British attack on Plattsburgh. And I find it interesting. I read Grodzinski's biography of him, and you mentioned Martinique earlier, but my impression was like in the Caribbean, when he had command, he was actually a very aggressive officer. But at Sackett's Harbor in Plattsburgh, he seemed very cautious and risk adverse. Do you have any thoughts as to why he changed?
Well, in Martinique, he was a divisional commander, and there was a lieutenant general over him. But in Canada, he uh, he was the commander in chief, and he was very sensitive about casualties because he knew it would be very hard to replace them. Regular infantry casualties would be hard to replace from Britain. So this is one thing. Um, uh, I think it was always in the back of his mind. And he did, let's see, he had three occasions, well, two occasions where some British officer remarked he was like a horse uh, about, about to jump a fence who would draw back at the last minute. At Sackett's Harbor, he could have pressed that attack more heavily than he did. But again, he didn't want to take the casualties. At Fort George, there was a reconnaissance in force by the British in August 1813. And it started out as just a uh, reconnaissance to see how the American pickets were placed or where they were placed and how strong they were. And it sort of took off. And before they knew it, the British were almost at the walls of Fort George. And when Prevost called them back, so he wasn't well liked for that. Plattsburgh, now, Prevost had the best army that Britain ever sent to North America. And uh, I would probably exempt the 7 Years' War Army, but certainly better than anything they sent during the Revolutionary War. He had two brigades of Wellington's veterans and another brigade of regular troops who had seen considerable service in Canada. The problem was that Plattsburgh was a sea and land um, operation, and the sea side of it, um, the British squadron on Lake Champlain under Captain Robert Downey attacked the American squadron. Um, I won't get into details again, but it was a complete and utter fiasco. Uh, the Americans captured almost every British ship. Now, at the same time, Prevost was trying to make an attack across into the defenses of Plattsburgh. He occupied the north part of the town, but he didn't have the south part of the town. But there were problems, and I'll have to get into this in a future uh, episode. There were problems in intelligence, and the land attack was a series of disunited blows. It didn't really come to anything. But as soon as Prevost learned of the defeat of the Navy, he ordered an immediate retreat, although because he felt, well, he worried that he would be cut off and that the American squadron would hamper a withdrawal to British territory. Um, he needn't have worried because the American squadron, although it was victorious, was terribly cut up. That was a hard fought battle. In any case, he ordered a retreat. And again, I want to talk about Sir Sidney Beckwith later. Um, under a falling rainstorm, they pulled out. There was no reason for them to withdraw so fast. They left great uh, amounts of stores and marched back as fast as they could across the border. Uh,
And then a lot of what would have been Wellington's commanders, I think they were upset, right? Like they felt like they were barely getting started and the attack got called off. Like they,
that's exactly right. But the
yeah.
guy who did him in was Sir James Yeo, the Royal Navy commander on uh, eh, on the lakes, and he never forgave him. It was his opinion that Prevost had rushed Downey into action before Downey was prepared, um, and so Armour grew up against him, um, and a lot of people were fed up with him, and he he requested a court of inquiry, and just before it was about to sit in England, he'd returned to England by this time. He died. So his name was never cleared. But I have some theories about the Plattsburgh expedition. I wrote a book about that, or rather, I wrote a book of which that expedition is part. Uh, the one thing I found was that these legends grow up like weeds around historical events. And there's one of these legends that Wellington's veterans deserted en masse at Plattsburgh, and were welcomed, of course, by the Americans. And all right, but then I checked the figures from the returns, and the figures for the desertion in the two brigades, which were veteran Wellington brigades, units of Wellington's army, very, very little desertion. The brigade, which contributed most of the desertion, was the Third Brigade, which was consisted of British units that had fought in North America for some time, and a foreign unit, the Watvilles. Yeah, um, the the, uh, the the British soldiers who had been in North America for some time knew they would be going back to England, I suppose, and life in the United States offered opportunity and freedom, and they were going to take account of it. They were this close; they were in American territory, so that's why there's this higher desertion rate.
And no language barrier, right? Very little cultural difference. If
Yeah,
they,
that's the other thing.
yeah,
Uh, no language barrier, so
okay.
it would be different than it was in the peninsula because you'd have to either speak Portuguese, Spanish, or French. Um, but yeah,
All right. Well, that wraps up this episode. So thank you so much, Don.
well, I have one more point to make.
Sure, let's hear it.
On the subject of desertion was prevalent during the Napoleonic period on both sides in the War of 1812. It's estimated that 25% of the American army deserted during the war, and uh, there was a kind of cross traffic over the border of Britons going south and Americans coming north. But at this time, desertion didn't have quite the same, um, I don't know, disaster, or not disaster, but uh, the same,
Negative cachet or
yeah, you got it, cachet that it does today. Um, it's it was largely many men when they enlisted regarded it as a contract between the officer who recruited them and themselves. And when they were got to regiments and were formed and put in another company, perhaps they didn't like it. But I can expand on that at some later date.
yeah, that could be a whole interesting study. Like as I understood it, the big crime was if you deserted and then appeared in the enemy's uniform, that then that was definitely not kosher. Yeah, I spent a lot of time studying the 41st desertions after the Battle of the Thames, and that was uh quite interesting, but they were at Newport Barracks, which is near modern day Cincinnati, and the Americans were actually actively recruiting in the prison camp, trying to incite them to desert. So, all right.
Yeah.
Well, this wraps up another session. We'll continue to produce these videos. We were originally talking 5 or 6. We might be 10 to 20 by the time we finish. We keep coming up with new potential topics.
Oh,
So
you get me going.
yeah, well, we're going to put these, they have their own playlist I created on our YouTube channel. So for our viewers, you can find the other videos on the playlist here on the History Symposium YouTube channel. And then also subscribe to our channel and you'll receive notifications whenever we put up a new upload. So thanks, Don. Really appreciate that.
Okay. I look forward to talking to you again.